Hi, we continue today in Genesis 12 with the first of the three wife-sister stories, as scholars tend to call them, here in chapter 12, verses 10 to 20. And we're going to look at this passage in two videos. Today we're going to look at the shape of the story in several angles, both intratextually, looking at the three wife-sister stories, this one in chapter 12, the one in chapter 20, and the one with Isaac in chapter 26, as well as looking intertextually at the way this story has many parallels with the Exodus story, of course in a different book, hence intertextually between Genesis and Exodus, two different texts. And then finally we're going to look at the chiastic structure that frames this little passage with the movement to and from Egypt. And so we'll do all that this time, and the next time we'll look more at the more literary aspects, at characterization and plot and what's going on here as Abram takes his wife down to Egypt in the context of a famine. So, as on the right side of the screen, as you can see, we're looking at the bigger picture from Rosenberg in this entire section. Not exactly a chiasm, but a structural shape, because he's trying to note the combination of cycle and story, of how different authors' sources have been put together into one general framework. And this is exactly where that begins to have direct relevance, because as you can see here in the D part, in the light orange, we see wife-sister episode, and on the other side we see another one, and that's what we're going to have to look at in a minute. So we're seeing this after, of course, the migration from Haran, done first to Haran from Dad Terah back here, and then from Abram and Sarai here, and then as we saw last time, the building of altars and the wandering around different places, which will be paralleled down here. So let's look first at the three wife-sister stories, and you can see the one in the middle in chapter 20 is in much smaller print because it's a much longer story. So that's one thing to note. And I've color-coded elements that are parallel, not exactly identical in each one. Let's go over those just briefly so we can see the elements that lead scholars to wonder what's going on in these three stories. So just in black at the beginning, we see the first one and the third one both say there's a famine in the land, and the third one refers directly back to this first one. And so that's one thing to note. The green part has to do with where they are, and although this one's in Egypt and the other two are in Gerar, they both say that Abram there is an alien or a stranger or a refugee, a migrant, depending on the translation, but these all have alien. So he went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, whereas in chapter 20 it says he was already residing in Gerar as an alien, and we'll look at the map in just a second to get an idea of that. And then in chapter 26, Isaac went down to Gerar, and then is told explicitly by Yahweh, don't go down to Egypt, but settle in this land as an alien. So that's where we see that parallel there. In all three of them, there's concern by the man that he will be killed because of the beauty of his woman or the attractiveness of his woman. So we see it here expressly made from Abram to Sarai. Here, it's in retrospect where Abraham at this point is telling the king Abimelech why he did it. And here, Isaac is thinking this to himself, but then he said it out loud to the same king, Abimelech, who here is described as King Abimelech of the Philistines, rather than King Abimelech of Gerar, but Gerar is a Philistine city, so that's not really much of a difference there. In all of them, we have something about say she is my sister, or say you are my sister, or in this case, Abraham saying she's my sister, and here Isaac saying she's my sister. In all of them, there's some kind of reward, and I'm sorry, in the first two there's a reward, and the third one there's no reward named, both in the form of sheep, oxen, and slaves, so we see that parallel here. But in chapter 20, in addition, there's 1,000 pieces of silver given, and that will play out in chapter 23 when Abraham is looking for a place to bury dead Sarah after the binding of Isaac scene. In the first two, but not the third one, there's some direct response of God to the opponent king or leader. Here, Yahweh afflicted Pharaoh and his house with plagues because of Sarai, and here God came to Abimelech in a dream. But here there's nothing. Here Abimelech sees out the window what's going on, so there's no divine intervention there. In this kind of grayish purple color here, each of them is confronted by the opposing king. Pharaoh called Abram and said, what have you done to me? And Abimelech called Abraham and said, what have you done to us, as opposed to me? And Abimelech, similarly, what is this you have done to us? And so we'll see the parallels there. In the light brown one here, it's Pharaoh who's saying, why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her as my woman? And so here it's King Abimelech saying, so she is your woman, why did you say she is my sister? But we don't have that one in the middle one. So a number of ways are parallel, and the question is, what's going on here? The traditional older way of looking at this was three different sources and trying to analyze this based on language. But of course, they all use Yahweh in one way or another here. So we see Yahweh here, we see Yahweh here, and we see Yahweh over here in the third one. So we can't distinguish these by one's a priestly and one is a Yahwist based on using Yahweh, which leads scholars to suggest that one could be an E-text, which is the understanding of what happened to the Yahwist text after the northern kingdom of Israel was defeated by Assyria in the 8th century, around 722, and a separate range of stories developed out of the common pair that would have been the Yahwist. But that's all assuming things that we don't really know and is really mostly abandoned by more recent scholars, who are tending to see these two as connected because 20 seems to be a comment or a theological alternative to chapter 12. But what does that say about this one over here? And another reason this really matters, because if we see these as three different versions of the same incident, in other words, a patriarch offered his wife as his sister to a foreign king, and these are just three different versions of the story, then we're looking to each story to what the author might be saying about his own time period, independent of the other stories. But if we look at them as part of one continuous narrative, whether originally that way or at least that way in the final version we have, then it has an effect on character. Because then we may be asking, Abraham, is he doing this everywhere? And in fact, there's a hint of that in the story, but we'll get there when we get to chapter 20. You can read it for yourself, see if you can find a hint that suggests this is a pattern they've been playing out throughout this land. So in other words, it gives us various possibilities for reconsidering the character of Abraham and of Sarai. If this was originally, for example, done out of fear, or maybe because they made a profit here, they thought, let's just run this scam all over. No one will know we did it elsewhere. And a pretty risky business, of course, because he really could die, but that's at least one possible inference from reading this as a continuous narrative. So we'll be paying attention to that as we go, but this is the most obvious example throughout the Abraham-Sarah cycle story of a story that seems to be repeated more than once. So let's look at it from another angle. Many scholars have noted this, originally Umberto Cassuto back in the 1960s, but this has been repeated by many others. Cassuto really ahead of his time as a Jewish scholar and not wanting to divide what for him was a sacred text up into sources, and that led him, for perhaps different reasons, to be had several decades for those who later rejected source theory instead of more narrative approaches in a modern vein. So Cassuto is, although writing 60 years ago now, has ongoing relevance. And many other scholars have followed this. I'm just using his because he was the original person that I'm aware of to show these parallels. So you see that the parallels begin in the Joseph story in the end of Genesis and continue into Exodus. So I've marked the ones with the big numbers, 43, 47, as part of Genesis, and the ones that are Exodus, specifically Exodus, which raises some other interesting questions that someone like Cassuto wouldn't address, which is, what's the time composition of relationship between Exodus and the Joseph story and these and the story in chapter 12? By my account, and I think by most scholars' account, the Exodus story is pretty old. I take it to be somewhere around the 9th century in the question of the succession after the time of Solomon, as in I wrote and come out my people. But in any event, older than the exile, certainly. And yet the Joseph story, by most accounts, is late. Probably Hellenistic. Its long style and its novellic form suggests something out of the Greek era, which would be in the 3rd or even 2nd century, in the time after Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabees. So the Joseph story, much later than almost anything in its surrounding, certainly later than anything in its surrounding context, and one of the oldest or the newest stories, the last written stories in the Hebrew Bible, before we get to the actual Septuagint. The stories written so late they weren't written in Hebrew at all, but just in Greek. So what the sequence could be that would lead the author of that much late story to integrate it with the Exodus story that makes it sort of rhyme with the Abraham story in chapter 12, Abram's story in chapter 12, isn't clear. But though they're the parallels you see, starting with the famine and the sojourn to Egypt and the question of being saved, moving from Joseph here to the question of the Israelites, obviously. But then more recently, Yair Zokovich, coming from a different angle, again writing as a Jewish author though, writes this article, Disgrace the Lies of the Patriarchs, and highlighting the contrast between Abram and the midwives in the Exodus story, showing that Abram lies to save himself, whereas the midwives lie to save the baby boys. Abram does not turn to Yahweh, but the midwives act in quote-unquote fear of Yahweh. Abram does not offer Pharaoh an explanation, but the midwives speak forthrightly to Pharaoh at the risk of their lives. Pharaoh improves Abram's life with all the cattle and gifts that we just saw, and God improves the midwives' lives. So whether we think of the midwives as being Israelites or being Egyptians who are acting on behalf of the quote-unquote Hebrews in that story, either way, they are listening to and concerned about the God of Israel. And Abram suddenly is not concerned with the very God who's called him out of Haran and onto this wild journey here. So we'll look more at that next time when we look at the characterization issues. Let's also look here briefly at the issue of location, because we see here, as we saw last time, they were coming down this way into, we saw into the south, into the Negev, and now that he's there, when there's this famine, he continues down this way. But as we'll see from the chiasm in a minute, framed by this back and forth to Gerar here. So Gerar, a city of the Philistines, as I noted earlier, and along with Ashdod and Ekron, this is Philistine territory. And so going down to Egypt and coming back, which sets up this chiasm, which you can see here. And this version of it is from Cephas Tushima, who's writing from South Africa, in this article entitled Exchange of Wife for Social and Food Security, a Famine Refugee Strategy for Survival. And as it turns out, the piece doesn't actually discuss that much about a famine refugee strategy, but goes into enormous and helpful detail about the chiastic structure of our immediate passage and as framed by the bracketed elements. So let's look at that just briefly here. So it starts with what we saw last video, Abram building an altar, worshiping Yahweh, and journeying from Bethel to the Negev. And then on the other side here, the closing bracket, journeying from the Negev to Bethel. So back up this way and visiting his altar and worshiping Yahweh. Again, I'm sorry, I misspoke to say back to Gerar. Eventually, of course, it will be to Gerar, but in this case, going to Bethel. Right up here. So then it's our story actually is framed here with the beginning with Abram facing the famine in Canaan and journeying from the Negev to Egypt, and then receiving at the end the abundance from Egypt and journeying back to the Negev. Then he gives a speech to Sarai before he enters into Egypt, and then Pharaoh gives his speech to Abram before the departure from Egypt. And in the center is Abram's exchanging Sarai for prosperity in Egypt, and Pharaoh marrying Sarah but afflicted with his house. And I've copied this directly from Tushima's article, but I would take some issue with the question of both whether he marries Sarai and whether it takes place in verse 17 or not. Because, as we'll see next video, the issue is Pharaoh takes Sarai into his house, but that's in verse 15. And whether this is marriage or simply a royal taking into a harem is another question. But what that shows us is of how this is framed in this symmetry. And one of the issues we'll look at next time is, does Abram learn a lesson from responding in fear to the issue of famine, not by consulting the God who's called him out of Haran and offered him all these promises, but by turning himself into the hands of empire and risking the life of his wife. So next time we'll take up the various arguments about characterization, including from the womanist author Will Gaffney, who suggests something from her experience that may be shocking to biblical readers, but expresses pretty honestly one way of reading the Abram story. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.